She was the woman they mocked, the outsider they underestimated, the fiancé they thought was lucky to marry a billionaire. But what they didn't know, she was a hidden legend, a fashion prodigy who had once ruled the industry before walking away. And when the day of her wedding arrived, she didn't just break their expectations, she shattered them. This is the story of Lena Caldwell, the woman who turned betrayal into triumph and left the world in awe. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. See you in the next one. Lena Caldwell stood in front of the full-length mirror, her fingers grazing the delicate lace of the wedding dress she had chosen. The soft chiffon cascaded down her body in gentle waves, hugging her figure in a way that felt both elegant and effortless. It wasn't adorned with extravagant jewels, nor was it a designer piece from one of the high-end boutiques Ethan's family frequented. But it was hers. The dress represented months of careful saving, of quiet dreams stitched together thread by thread. It was everything she had ever wanted. She turned slightly, admiring the way the fabric shimmered under the warm glow of the boutique lights. The scent of fresh roses filled the air, blending with the faint aroma of silk and chiffon. It was perfect. "It's beautiful," she murmured to herself, running her fingers along the embroidered sleeves. A warmth spread through her chest, a sense of contentment that had been hard to come by lately. She had spent weeks preparing for this wedding, ignoring the whispered remarks, the cold glances from Ethan's mother, the way his friends barely concealed their amusement whenever she spoke. She had convinced herself that none of it mattered, that love was enough. The boutique door swung open, and the warmth in Lena's chest vanished instantly. "No way." Ethan's voice cut through the quiet space, filled with something sharp, mocking amusement. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, clad in a tailored navy blue suit that fit him to perfection. His sharp blue eyes scanned the boutique lazily before landing on her. A slow smirk pulled at his lips. "This is what you're wearing to our wedding?" he asked, stepping closer. Lena's stomach twisted. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady.
Yeah.
Ethan let out a laugh, a short, incredulous sound. "Gah, Lena," he muttered, shaking his head. "It looks so—" The words landed like a slap. Her breath hitched, fingers curling into the soft fabric of her dress. She forced herself to stand tall, even as heat rushed to her cheeks. "It's not cheap," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I chose it because—" "Because what?" Ethan interrupted, raising a brow. "Because it was on sale?" Behind him, two of his friends, Jared and Lucas, exchanged knowing smirks. They had never seen her as an equal, never once considered her worthy of standing beside Ethan. And now their amusement was written all over their faces. Then, as if the moment couldn't get any worse, Victoria Whitmore swept into the room. Ethan's mother carried an air of effortless sophistication, dressed in a cream-colored silk blouse and perfectly tailored slacks. Everything about her presence was deliberate, poised, graceful, and utterly condescending. She took one glance at Lena in the mirror, and a quiet sigh slipped past her lips. "Oh, darling," she said, shaking her head slightly. "Is that really the dress you want?" Lena's throat tightened. "Yes," she forced out. "I love it." Ethan let out another dry chuckle. "Lena, be serious. You're about to marry into one of the wealthiest families in the country. Do you really think you can walk down the aisle in that thrift store-looking thing?" Jared laughed outright this time, and Lucas followed suit, their quiet chuckles filling the boutique like nails scraping against glass. Lena felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath her feet. She had always known she didn't belong in their world, that she had come from a different place, one where money wasn't thrown around like confetti. But never before had the divide felt so painfully wide. Her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed the fabric of her dress. "It's not about the price," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "This dress means something to me. It's the one I want to wear." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "I'm not trying to be mean, Lena," he said, as if his words hadn't just cut her open. "I just expected more." Victoria stepped forward then, placing a gentle hand on her son's arm. "Why don't we find something more fitting for you, dear?" she said, her voice smooth and sweet. "I know a designer in Paris who would be happy to make a custom gown. Something worthy of the Whitmore name." Lena's heart clenched. Worthy. As if she wasn't already. As if a dress determined whether or not she belonged. She looked at Ethan, searching for something, anything, that showed he understood how much this hurt her. But there was nothing, just his smug, unconcerned expression, as if her feelings were nothing more than an afterthought. Something inside her snapped. Lena took a slow, steady breath, then stepped off the fitting platform. "Thank you for your offer," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I've already made my choice." She turned toward the mirror one last time, taking in the dress that represented everything she was. Then she looked at Ethan, holding his gaze as she added quietly, "And one day, you'll realize what a mistake it was to underestimate me." Ethan arched a brow, amused. "We'll see about that." Lena said nothing more. But in her heart, she made a silent promise. He would regret every single word. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate was drenched in golden light, the chandeliers casting an opulent glow over the sea of impeccably dressed guests. Waiters in crisp white jackets weaved through the crowd, offering champagne on silver trays as soft orchestral music filled the air. It was a scene straight out of a high society fairy tale, one that Lena was slowly realizing she didn't belong in. She sat stiffly beside Ethan at the head table, her fingers wrapped around the stem of her untouched champagne flute. Every detail of this engagement party had been meticulously planned, from the imported floral arrangements to the string quartet flown in from Italy. Yet, despite all the luxury surrounding her, Lena had never felt more out of place. Across the table, Jared Kingsley swirled his wine lazily, his sharp eyes gleaming with amusement as he leaned back in his chair. "So Lena," he drawled, dragging out her name like it was some sort of inside joke. "How does it feel to go from rags to riches overnight?" Lena's grip on her glass tightened, but she forced a pleasant smile. "I didn't fall into riches," she said, smoothly. A chorus of laughter rippled around the table. "Oh, honey, that's adorable," another guest smirked, tilting her glass toward Lena, as if to toast her naivety. "But let's be honest, do you really think Ethan would have looked at you twice if you weren't stunning?" Lena's stomach twisted. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a new voice cut through the conversation. "You must forgive them, dear," Victoria Whitmore interjected, her tone as polished as the pearls around her neck. She offered Lena a smile, but there was nothing warm about it. "They just don't understand how traditional this arrangement is." Lena turned to her, the words settling uncomfortably in her chest. Victoria took a slow sip of her wine before placing the crystal glass back on the table with practiced elegance. "Well, Ethan has always been expected to marry within our social circle. It's a bit of a shock for everyone, you see. This whole Cinderella thing." Lena felt her throat tighten. She had never considered herself a Cinderella. She hadn't come into Ethan's world looking for a prince to rescue her. She had worked hard for everything she had in life, And yet here she was, being reduced to nothing more than a charity case. A lucky commoner plucked from obscurity. "I didn't realize love was limited to tax brackets," she said, keeping her voice even. Victoria chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Love is lovely, dear, but marriage—" She leaned in slightly, as if she were letting Lena in on a great secret. "Marriage is about partnerships, about compatibility." The implication was clear. She wasn't compatible. She wasn't one of them, and she never would be. Lena turned to Ethan, waiting for him to say something, to defend her, to tell them they were wrong. But he only smirked, taking a sip of his drink as if he found all of this amusing. Her heart sank. He had heard every single insult, every condescending remark, and yet he did nothing. Didn't stop them. Didn't correct them. Didn't stand up for her. It was as if he didn't see the problem at all. And that was when it hit her. The realization that felt like ice water pouring down her spine. Had he ever truly loved her? Or had she just been a novelty? A temporary thrill before he settled for someone more. The thought made her stomach churn, but she refused to let them see her break. Not here. Not now. Instead, she lifted her chin, smiled, and played along. She endured the rest of the evening with practiced grace, laughing at all the right moments, nodding at all the expected remarks. She became the perfect, agreeable fiancée they all assumed she should be. But deep inside, something shifted. Because, for the first time, Lena wasn't just questioning the wedding. She was questioning everything. And one thing was certain. They would regret underestimating her. The world saw Lena Caldwell as just another ordinary girl, a lucky woman who had somehow captured the attention of Ethan Whitmore, heir to one of the most powerful fortunes in the country. To them, she was nothing special. Just an outsider trying to claw her way into a world where she didn't belong. They were wrong. Lena wasn't some small-town girl with no direction. She wasn't some gold digger looking for a way up. Once upon a time, she'd been a fashion prodigy, a rising star in the industry, designing breathtaking gowns for the elite, her work sought after by celebrities and royalty alike. Her work sought after by celebrities and royalty alike. She had walked the streets of Paris, sketched designs in the studios of Milan, and watched her creations come to life on the runways of New York. She had stood on the brink of something extraordinary, her name whispered in designer circles as the next great talent. Until everything changed. Her mother had fallen gravely ill, and in the blink of an eye, Lena had been forced to make an impossible choice. She could have stayed, continued chasing success, let the world adore her while her mother fought her battle alone. Or she could walk away. She chose family. She gave up the flashing cameras, the magazine covers, the endless potential of a future she had dreamed of since she was a child. She left it all behind to be by her mother's side until the very end. And by the time her mother was gone, so was her place in the industry. The world moved on without her. Her name faded into the background, forgotten, and she let it happen. For years, she convinced herself she didn't miss it, that she was content with a quieter life. She told herself she didn't need the validation, didn't need to prove anything to anyone. And then Ethan Whitmore had come along. Charming, confident, magnetic. He had swept her into a world she had once walked away from, made her believe that love could be enough. But love wasn't enough. Not when the man who claimed to love her was too blind to see her worth. Not when he looked at the wedding dress she had poured her heart into and called it cheap. He had no idea who she really was. None of them did. Because that dress, the one they had laughed at, mocked, ridiculed, It was her most personal piece. Every stitch, every delicate, lace detail had been crafted by her own hands. She had spent months designing it in secret, pouring her soul into every inch of fabric. It wasn't just a dress. It wasn't just a dress. It was a tribute to her mother, to the dream she had once abandoned, to the talent she had let the world forget. And yet, Ethan had looked at it and seen nothing. He had called it cheap without realizing that his fiancée was capable of creating masterpieces, without realizing that once upon a time, women would have paid a fortune just to wear one of her designs. But she didn't tell him. She didn't tell any of them. Because she didn't need to. She would let them think whatever they wanted. Let them laugh. Let them underestimate her. Because when the wedding day arrived, when she walked down that aisle, she would make sure they never forgot the moment they had dismissed her. She would show them who she truly was. And by then, it would be too late. The grand cathedral stood bathed in golden light, its towering stained glass windows casting soft hues of blue and crimson across the marble floors. Rows of white roses lined the aisle, their delicate petals trembling under the weight of hushed whispers. The air was thick with anticipation, with judgment, with the quiet certainty that today would mark the union of power and prestige. Ethan Whitmore stood at the altar, adjusting the cuff of his designer suit, his expression unreadable. Around him, the city's most influential figures murmured in expectation, their gazes flicking toward the grand doors of the cathedral. "I still can't believe he's marrying her," someone whispered. "She's lucky, that's for sure. I heard her dress is a disaster. Can't wait to see it." Ethan smirked slightly at the last comment, his mind briefly flashing back to the gown Lena had chosen. He had expected her to change it, assumed that, under enough pressure, she would relent, that his mother would have convinced her to wear something more appropriate. Surely, she wouldn't actually go through with it. And then, the music shifted. The grand doors swung open, and Lena stepped inside. The world stilled. Every murmur, every whisper, every breath in the room seemed to vanish into thin air. Ethan felt his own heartbeat falter. Because the woman walking toward him, the woman he had mocked, underestimated, was nothing short of breathtaking. The dress was not the simple gown he had ridiculed. It was something entirely otherworldly. The fabric shimmered under the cathedral's glow, cascading around her like liquid stardust. Every inch of lace had been woven into the gown with an artistry so intricate it looked as though it had melted into her skin. The embroidery caught the light, giving the illusion that she was glowing from within, as if she had been touched by something divine. She looked like a queen. No, she looked like a goddess. A murmur spread through the cathedral like wildfire. "Who designed that?" someone whispered. "That's not an off-the-rack dress. That's a masterpiece." Ethan's mother, Victoria, gripped the pearls at her throat, her face frozen in shock. Even Jared and Lucas, the friends who had spent weeks laughing behind Lena's back, stared at her in stunned disbelief. But none of them were as shaken as Ethan. Because as she walked closer, he wasn't just struck by the dress. He was struck by her. The way she held her head high, her shoulders squared with absolute confidence. The way she moved, not like someone desperate to be accepted, not like the meek fiancée he had assumed she was, but like a woman who knew her worth. And for the first time since he had met her, Ethan felt something foreign stir in his chest. Fear. Fear. Because he realized, in that very moment, he had never truly seen her before. And now, he was afraid it was too late. A stunned silence filled the grand cathedral, thick and suffocating. Every pair of eyes followed Lena as she walked down the aisle, each step echoing against the marble floors like the ticking of a clock, counting down to something inevitable. The whispers had died away, replaced by something more potent, pure, unfiltered awe. Ethan stood frozen at the altar, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This wasn't the woman he had dismissed, the one he had taken for granted. The Lena before him was untouchable, radiant, carrying herself with the effortless grace of someone who knew exactly who she was. And then, a voice broke the silence. A chair scraped against the floor as an older man in the front row stood abruptly, his sharp gaze locked onto Lena's gown. Gasps rippled through the crowd as recognition dawned on his face. "No," he breathed, stepping forward. "It can't be." The man was Marco DeLuca, a legend in the fashion world, a designer whose name alone carried more weight than an entire empire. Lena stopped, her expression unreadable as Marco moved closer, studying the dress with the kind of reverence reserved for something holy. "This dress," he murmured, his voice laced with disbelief. "This is an original." A ripple of gasps followed his words. Guests leaned toward one another, their shock spreading like wildfire. Ethan's stomach dropped. "What?" he blurted out, but no one was listening. Marco turned to the crowd, his expression fierce. "I have seen thousands of gowns in my lifetime, but this," his voice shook with admiration, "this is the work of a true artist." The room held its breath. Then his gaze flickered back to Lena, his eyes narrowing in recognition. A slow, knowing smile spread across Lena's lips. She held her chin high, her voice steady, unwavering. "I did." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, all at once, the room erupted. A chorus of disbelief, of gasps and murmurs, filled the cathedral. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath his feet, his pulse hammering in his ears. No. No. It wasn't possible. He turned to Lena, his mind racing. "You," his throat was dry, "you made this?" She met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw something dangerous. Something victorious. "Yes, Ethan." Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "I made this." His breath caught. She stepped forward, her dress gliding effortlessly against the floor. "You called my gown cheap," she said, her words slicing through the air like a blade. "You laughed at me, you let your friends and your mother belittle me, and you said nothing." Ethan felt something unfamiliar claw at his chest, shame. Lena's expression didn't waver. "But what you didn't know," she continued, "was that I was never just some girl who stumbled into your world." She took a slow breath, then delivered the final blow. "Before I left the industry, I was known as Loran." A collective gasp echoed through the cathedral. Ethan's blood ran cold. The name hit him like a freight train. Laurent, Loran, the Laurent. The mysterious designer whose work had been sought after by royalty, by Hollywood's elite, by the wealthiest and most powerful people in the world. The same Laurent who had vanished years ago, leaving the fashion industry in a state of confusion and loss. His fiancée, the woman he had mocked, underestimated, and treated like she was nothing, was her. His chest tightened as realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. She had never needed his world. She had built her own. And now, standing before him, she was no longer the woman he had dismissed. She was something far greater. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Whitmore had no words. A heavy silence filled the grand cathedral, the weight of Lena's revelation sinking into the stunned crowd, like a stone dropped into still water. Laurent. The name lingered in the air, electrifying, undeniable. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. Lena, his fiancée. The woman he had ridiculed, dismissed, underestimated, was the very designer whose name had once commanded the highest circles of fashion. The Laurent, the prodigy, who had vanished without a trace, leaving the industry mourning the loss of an irreplaceable talent. And he had laughed at her. He had called her work cheap. A hollow, sinking feeling coiled in his stomach. Gasps and murmurs spread like wildfire. Ethan's mother, Victoria Whitmore, sat frozen, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the edge of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Jared and Lucas, the same friends who had once mocked Lena alongside him, now stared at her in stunned silence, their smirks wiped clean. But Lena was unfazed. She stood before them, radiant, unshaken, untouchable. Ethan took a step forward, reaching for her. Lena. She lifted a hand. The single motion stopped him cold. Don't. The word was quiet, but the weight behind it was everything. His breath hitched. I was wrong, he admitted, his voice raw, unsteady. Lena's gaze didn't waver. That's the problem, Ethan, she said, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. You never cared enough to know. The words struck him harder than he expected. She took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. You saw what you wanted to see, a girl who didn't fit into your world the way you expected. And when I didn't, you mocked me. Her tone was calm, but there was no mistaking the quiet storm beneath it. You let your friends laugh at me. You let your mother humiliate me. And you never once stood up for me. Ethan swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. She was right. She was right about everything. For the first time in his life, he had no excuse, no justification, no way to talk his way out of what he had done. Because he had failed her. And now he was about to lose her. Lena took a deep breath, her next words slicing through him like a final, devastating blow. I will not marry you, Ethan. The cathedral erupted in gasps. Victoria let out a strangled sound of disbelief. The officiant, who had been standing silently at the altar, froze mid-sentence, his expression a perfect reflection of the collective shock that gripped the room. Ethan's heart pounded. What? He whispered, barely able to breathe. Lena met his gaze, unwavering. I deserve someone who saw my worth from the beginning, she said, voice steady, strong. Not just when it became undeniable. The words settled between them like the final nail in a coffin. And then she turned. With slow, deliberate steps, Lena walked down the aisle, no longer a bride, but a woman reclaiming her power. All around her, whispers swelled like crashing waves. She's really leaving. This is legendary. She just humiliated the Whitmores in front of everyone. Ethan wanted to call after her, wanted to fix this. But deep down, he knew. She was already gone. And the only thing left for him to do was watch the best thing in his life walk away. The aftermath was nothing short of chaos. By the time Lena stepped out of the Grand Cathedral, the whispers inside had erupted into a wildfire of scandal that no one could contain. Cameras flashed as news of the runaway bride spread through the elite guests like an unstoppable current, rippling outward into the world beyond. Ethan stood motionless at the altar, his mind unable to keep up with what had just happened. One moment, he had been waiting to say, I do, expecting Lena to become his wife. The next, she had torn his carefully controlled world apart with just a few devastating words. I will not marry you, Ethan. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't wept. She had simply stated it, a truth so absolute, so final, that there was no space left for argument. Somewhere in the room, his mother finally found her voice. You let her humiliate us. Victoria Whitmore hissed, her carefully composed exterior fracturing under the weight of public disgrace. You should have controlled the situation before it got this far. Ethan barely heard her. He was still staring at the cathedral doors, at the place where Lena had stood just moments before. She had left. She had really left. And now, the world was about to tear him apart. By the next morning, it was everywhere. Billionaire groom mocks fiancée's wedding dress. She walks out in front of hundreds. Runaway bride or runaway victory. The wedding scandal that brought a tycoon to his knees. Ethan Whitmore, publicly shamed as ex-fiancé, turns out to be a fashion icon. The headlines were merciless. Ethan scrolled through them in silence, the glow of his phone screen illuminating the darkened penthouse. Every article, every social media post, every sharp-edged joke at his expense sent another blow straight to his gut. His company's stock took a hit, not major but noticeable enough that investors were whispering. The media feasted on the humiliation, dragging his name through every late-night segment and social feed. And his so-called friends? They laughed behind his back. The same men who had once sat beside him, mocking Lena with casual cruelty, now avoided eye contact when his name was brought up, unwilling to be caught in the flames of his disgrace. The most brutal part: Lena wasn't just fine. She was thriving. The world had seen her walk out of that cathedral, head held high, and they had decided they loved her for it. Her name trended across every platform. Lena Caldwell. No. Laurent. Lorraine. The world now knew who she really was, and they wanted more. Fashion brands, designers, investors. Everyone was reaching out, desperate to be a part of her return. Articles celebrated her. News segments called her the woman who walked away from wealth and still won. And when asked about Ethan, she simply smiled and said, "I wish him well, but I know my worth now, and I won't settle for anything less." It was the ultimate power move. She didn't need revenge. Her success was revenge enough. Ethan stared at the words, feeling something unfamiliar and bitter coil in his chest. Regret. Deep, unshakable regret. Because now, the whole world knew what he had been too blind to see. He had let go of something priceless, and he would never get it back. Lena Caldwell was no longer a footnote in Ethan Whitmore's life. She was no longer the girl they had mocked, the outsider they had looked down on. She had risen from the ashes of their ridicule and built something they could never take away from her. Her name, her real name, was everywhere now. Laurent. The Return of Laurent. It was printed across magazine covers, whispered in fashion circles, and splashed across headlines that called her the greatest comeback in couture history. She had walked away from Ethan Whitmore and straight into a world that finally saw her for what she was. Not just his former fiancée. A legend. Offers poured in from the most prestigious fashion houses, Chanel, Valentino, Dior, each one desperate to claim her as their own. But Lena didn't need their validation. She had spent too many years letting other people define her worth. Now, she was building something hers. Her own label. Her own empire. And she was doing it on her terms. The first collection under her newly revived name sold out before it even launched. Celebrities, royalty, and the fashion elite fought for a chance to wear her designs. The very people who had once overlooked her were now the ones begging to be part of her world. But the best part: she had done it all without Ethan. He had expected her to fade, to disappear into obscurity, drowning in regret. Instead, she had become unstoppable. And he was nothing more than a cautionary tale now. She saw the articles about him, the whispers in business circles about how his name had been dragged through the mud. about how he had lost more than just a fiancé that day. He had lost face. He had lost respect. And worst of all, he had lost her. But Lena didn't waste time thinking about Ethan Whitmore anymore. She was too busy thriving, too busy living. Because for the first time in a long time, she was exactly where she was meant to be. And this time, no one would ever doubt her again. Ethan Whitmore had always been a man who got what he wanted: wealth, power, admiration. His life had been built on effortless success, on the quiet certainty that the world would always bend to his will. But now, for the first time, he was the one watching from the sidelines. Lena's name, Laurent, was everywhere. Every magazine cover, every red carpet, every high-profile event featured her designs. Women who once scoffed at her were now clamoring to wear her creations. The same fashion critics who had dismissed her as nothing more than a fortunate fiancée now hailed her as a visionary. And Ethan? He was nothing more than a shadow in her story. He saw her in the pages of Vogue standing beside Marco De Luca, her posture regal, her smile effortless. He watched her being interviewed on television, her confidence radiant, her voice smooth as she spoke about her journey, her art, her future. When they asked about him, about the wedding that never was, she merely smiled and said, "I have no regrets. Walking away was the best decision I ever made." It shouldn't have stung, but it did. Ethan tried to ignore the growing emptiness that settled in his chest every time he saw her. He buried himself in work, in parties, in meaningless distractions. But no matter where he went, she was there. Her name whispered in conversations, her design worn by the most powerful women in the world. He tried to move on, but no one could compare. The women he once charmed now felt dull, uninteresting. They laughed at his jokes, batted their lashes, played their roles perfectly. But none of them challenged him. None of them carried that quiet fire, that unshakable strength that Lena had. He hadn't realized it at the time, but she had been the only person who had ever truly seen him. Not just for his wealth or his name, but for the man he could have been. And he had let her go. No, he had pushed her away. Now, she was untouchable, unreachable. A woman he had once held in his hands and let slip through his fingers like sand. Ethan Whitmore had always been a man who got what he wanted. But this time, he had lost the only thing that ever really mattered, and he would spend the rest of his life regretting it. Lena had not searched for love. After Ethan, after the humiliation, after proving to the world, and to herself that she was far more than the woman they had dismissed, she had told herself she needed time. Time to heal. Time to rediscover who she was beyond the wreckage of what could have been. And for a while, she had been content with that. Her days were filled with passion, with art, with a career that no longer felt like a compromise. She traveled between Paris, Milan, and New York, not as an outsider looking in, but as a force to be reckoned with. Her collections sold out within hours. Her brand, Laurent, became synonymous with elegance and power, a name whispered in the highest circles with nothing but admiration. She'd built something extraordinary, something no one could take from her. And yet, despite all of it, despite the success, the accolades, the quiet satisfaction of proving them wrong, there were still moments when she wondered, not about Ethan, never about him, but about love. Not the grand illusions of fairy tales, not the glittering promises whispered by men who only saw her as a conquest, but something real, something steady, something she had almost forgotten existed. And then, somehow without her noticing, it found her. Not in a whirlwind of passion, not in dramatic declarations under moonlit skies, but in quiet conversations over coffee, in laughter that felt effortless, in the presence of someone who had never once asked her to prove herself. Nathan Carter had been in her life for years, lingering at the edges, never demanding more than she was willing to give. He had been there when she had needed a friend, a confidant, someone who didn't see her as Laurent the designer, or Lena the walked away from a billionaire, or Lena the woman who had walked away from a billionaire. He simply saw her. At first, she hadn't realized it. She had been so focused on rebuilding, on thriving, on becoming everything they had once said she couldn't be. But then one evening, as they sat across from each other in a small Parisian cafe, the soft hum of the city around them, she had caught herself watching him laugh. Really watching him. And the thought had slipped into her mind so easily, so effortlessly, that it had taken her breath away. This feels right. It wasn't forced. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't a battle for approval or validation. It was simple. And for the first time in her life, she realized that maybe love, real love, was never meant to be something you had to fight for. Maybe it was meant to be something that simply was. And so, she let herself have it. Not in desperation, not in fear of loneliness, but because she wanted it. Because she chose it. Because for the first time, she was with someone who had never needed her to be anything other than exactly who she was. And that was the greatest victory of all. Ethan had spent months convincing himself that Lena would come back. That, once the dust settled, once the headlines moved on to the next scandal, once her anger cooled, she would realize what she had walked away from. She would realize that no matter how far she ran, no matter how successful she became, their world, his world, was where she truly belonged. But as time passed, as he watched her rise higher and higher, he began to understand a truth he had been too arrogant to see before. She wasn't coming back. She had never belonged to his world. She had only ever belonged to herself. And so, in a final, desperate attempt to fix what he had broken, he reached out. He didn't send flowers, didn't make some grand public gesture. Lena wasn't the kind of woman to be won over with empty performances. Instead, he did something he had never done before. He humbled himself. He sent her a message, simple, honest, and stripped of the pride that had always been his downfall. I was wrong. I didn't see you for who you really were, and I regret that more than anything. If there's any part of you that still wonders, any part of you that still cares, I'd like to see you. No expectations, no pressure, just a conversation. He waited. And waited. And when her response finally came, it was only one sentence. There is nothing left to say. He had expected anger, had expected her to lash out, to throw his mistakes back in his face. But this was worse. Because this wasn't hate. It was indifference. And that was when he knew, really, truly knew, that he had lost her. Not just for now. Not just for a little while. But forever. She had moved on. And he would spend the rest of his life learning how to live with the regret of letting her go. The morning sun bathed Paris in golden light, spilling over cobblestone streets and casting long, soft shadows across the quiet cafe, where Lena sat, a delicate porcelain cup warming her hands. Laughter drifted through the air, mingling with the distant hum of the city waking up around her. Across the table, Nathan smiled at her, his eyes filled with the quiet understanding that had drawn her to him in the first place. She had never imagined herself here, not just in Paris, not just at the peak of her career, but in this place of peace, of happiness, of freedom. A year had passed since she walked away from Ethan Whitmore and never looked back. A year since she chose herself over the expectations of a world that had never truly valued her. And in that time, everything had changed. The Lena Caldwell who had once doubted her worth, who had once let the whispers and judgments of the elite make her feel less than, was gone. In her place stood Loran, a woman who had reclaimed her power, who had taken every insult, every doubt, every moment of dismissal, and turned it into the foundation of an empire. Her name had become more than just a brand. It had become a statement. A declaration that talent, resilience, and self-worth would always triumph over arrogance and entitlement. She had built something extraordinary, not because of Ethan, not in spite of him, but because she was always meant to. And now she was happy, truly, deeply happy. Not because she had proven them wrong, not because she had risen above their expectations, but because she had finally created a life that belonged to her, one not dictated by wealth, by status, by someone else's name. Nathan reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a silent gesture of warmth. It was simple, effortless. It felt right. Because love wasn't meant to be something you had to fight for, something you had to prove yourself worthy of. It was meant to be something that found you when you were ready for it. And as she sat there, sipping her coffee, listening to the sounds of the city she adored, she knew she was finally free. Somewhere, far from the streets of Paris, Ethan Whitmore sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the skyline that no longer felt as invincible as it once had. He had everything money could buy. But none of it mattered. Because no amount of wealth, no amount of power, could fill the void she had left behind. He had spent a lifetime believing that he was untouchable, that the world bent to his will, and yet the one thing he had truly wanted, the one thing he had let slip through his fingers, was now beyond his reach. Lena had moved forward, and he was forever stuck in the past. The greatest mistake of his life was not just losing her. It was never seeing her for who she really was, until it was too late. Lena, meanwhile, had already let it go. As she and Nathan stepped out of the cafe, walking hand in hand through the golden streets, she didn't look back. Because she didn't need to. She had always been enough. They had just been too blind to see it. Lesson from the story. Lena's journey teaches us one of the most valuable lessons in life. Self-worth is not something others give you. It's something you claim for yourself. She walked into a world that never truly saw her, that dismissed her, mocked her, and tried to mold her into something she was never meant to be. But instead of bending, instead of breaking, she chose to rise. She chose to prove, not to them, but to herself, that she was more than the limits they placed on her. Her story is a reminder that success is the best response to doubt. That walking away from the wrong people, no matter how painful, is often the greatest decision you will ever make. It also shows that love, real, true love, is not about wealth, status, or convenience. It's about respect, about being seen and valued for who you truly are. And most importantly, it's about never settling for less than what you deserve. And then there's Ethan, a man who had everything but lost the one thing money couldn't buy. His story serves as a warning. If you take people for granted, if you fail to see their worth when it matters, you may wake up one day and realize you've lost them forever. So let this story be a lesson. Know your worth. Protect your dreams. Walk away from those who don't value you. And when the world doubts you, let your success be your answer. Where are you watching from today? Drop your country in the comments. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. See you in the next one.